Many fantasy settings contain university analogues, where gowned teachers and various students go around studying magic. This sort of thing has become very popular, and there's an entire fantasy subgenre about people going to schools that teach magic, for instance. But so often these boil down to training schools for youths, or technical colleges, where people are taught the secrets of a trade. Again, the secrets of making magic. Who's doing the actual research? And what should fantasy academia look like, anyway? Our earliest universities traded primarily in three disciplines: theology, medicine, and law. After all, these are the three areas where it is really quite important to have qualified, learned professionals. Matters of one's immortal soul, bodily health, and the law are critical matters where you don't want just anyone able to weigh in authoritatively. But the first hurdle we face in seeing university-type institutions established in a fantasy world is that in ours, at least, powerful monotheistic faiths are the originators of these institutions. From the oldest universities, the Arabic madrasas, to those which swept Europe by papal dispensation, houses of learning originate as a place to ensure that students of faith, with their most important of jobs, are getting things right. But how could a university operate as a unified system under polytheistic faith structures, in which any god is likely to have its own mystery cult, detractors, and schismatic debates? Without organised, or at least semi-centralised religious authority, it's hard to imagine any such university set up by a mystery cult getting widespread attention, power, or authority. Any such institution needs the backing of an authority recognised throughout the land. Then, the monarch. Indeed, as we move further into the history of academia, we do see more monarchs setting up universities or colleges to glorify their name, fill their courts with wise, learned folks, and to attract intellectual elites. So you see, founding a university is like funding a group of particularly clever people to sit around all day and share their wisdom. It's expensive and, in the short term, seems like a waste. Just bring the clever people directly into your court as your advisors instead. Then you have the best information. So we can't just use any monarch. In essence, we need a stable, well-established monarchy, likely with a significant urban centre, before the notion of a house of learning makes more sense than a series of dedicated apprentice-master style relationships. But to the central question, what should a fantasy university actually be involved in studying? I would be silly to not at some point mention the unseen university, which, like all things Pratchett, is deeply parodic in tone. Vindictive astronomy, esoteric studies, and extreme horticulture all sound like wonderful courses of study, but in large part indicate a somewhat postmodern academia, replete with bloat and redundancy. As mentioned, early universities do have a specific and direct point to them. Not to train the next generation of extreme horticulturalists, but to provide learning and authority to those who weigh in on those most important of matters. I'd like to look at this from two different perspectives. Slightly more grounded fantasy with less available magic and divine influence, and then a D&D styled fantasy world at the end, as a point of contrast, comparison, and intrigue. So, lowish magic, not massively active gods. For this sort of world, I would expect those three major historical strands, theology, law, and medicine, to dominate. But depending on the potency and frequency of magic, it is possible that magical research will be a fourth critical subject. Curiously, a lot of the work done in our own oldest universities lay in the translation and debating of older texts. Not just in theology either. Natural law was a foundational concept in legal philosophy, coming from the Greeks, and medicine still owed an awful lot to Greek anatomy and Galenic humus. In fantasy worlds with an ancient empire aesthetic, which in fairness is a lot of them, academics can expect to be polymaths, translators, interpreters, and scientists seeking to both understand ancient wisdom and apply it. This, of course, necessitates the assumption that the ancients were right, or at least had some insights lost to modernity, which in some cases, even in our own world, is occasionally dubious. Medicine and law are both philosophical and practical pursuits based largely in observation and adherence to texts. There's likely not too much systematic change in these subjects. Perhaps new forms of legal protection against magic, or legal documentation through magic, or different diseases, curses, and ways of healing. But at least in terms of faith, I actually do not know of any traditional university structure in our real world's history which doesn't presuppose a monotheistic faith in its theology, at least in its foundational mission, other than, of course, universities that seek to be secular, impartial, and all of that situation. But I don't think there is a single polytheistic university. Excitingly, this puts fantasy in kind of a novel spot. How could one study the structures and truths of the divine without access to each divinity's mystery cult, oracles, and seers who represent these divine actors most closely? Well, there's a few ways. Firstly, broad philosophical or logical examinations of the divine order. Systematic theologies which seek to map the divine to the heavens. Perhaps investigative work to determine the planar or divine locuses of the god's power. Attempts to link astrological symbology to divine attitudes or actors would be likely as approaches, as would translations and reinterpretations of ancient myths in an attempt to place these stories, these ancient tales, in to the modern or natural world. Think something like the Mormon attempts to map the travels of Jesus in a way that suggests that he visited America. Similar geographical arguments are likely to take place where the university or the commissioning monarch is placed in a geographical alignment with some huge important religious situation that they feel it's good to be associated with. After all, we must remember that founding a university is a PR decision. The monarch must be flattered, and a great way to do this is to use divine theory to justify their rule, their wealth, or their wars. Another possibility is that we observe a sort of syncretism take place, where the theological university establishment seeks to establish itself as a body of knowledge which precedes all of these separate, disparate mystery cults. Perhaps these theological academics seek to create a streamlined version of their entire polytheistic faith, or to create a calendar of worship designed to honour every deity in the best way for those faithful folks who may seek perfection. Perhaps even a systematic and syncretic attempt to amalgamate all of the individual myths surrounding each deity, perhaps creating some grand synthesis of every foundational myth, each given its own place in a very carefully worked out history, and each hammered into one single narrative that makes logical sense. This would be similar to Bede's History of the English People, or the collation of the original Torah, but entirely for divine interconnected drama. Think the sagas of Ragnarok mixed with James Ussher's attempt to date the Bible, which found that the world's origin was in 4004 BC. Old school theology like this contained a lot more maths, philosophy, and science than most people imagine. I use science in quotation marks here because theology was technically a science, and some of the cleverest minds pondering these ideas and theories and practical conclusions were within that border. But it is true that early theology had no access to any scientific method. Finally, depending on the danger, presence, and variety of monstrous beasts in a world like this, it is likely that medicine expands its remit somewhat into the world of monsters. After all, Pliny the Elder wrote, or well, in fact made up, that hedgehogs store fallen fruit on their spines. Ancient writers were fascinated with explaining natural beasts. Imagine their investment in beasts of the mythical and magical kind. The true nature of the troll, including experiments on regeneration, the mating and breeding habits of kobolds, and theories that overly gorged kobolds can lay dragon eggs sometimes. Anything is on the table. Besides, unlike understanding how hedgehogs act, understanding the beasts who ruin civilizations is an eminently practical concern. Witches spring to mind as a practically focused exemplar of this very idea, but any kingdom with a monster ecologist in residence rests a little safer at night, especially when that knowledge starts to trickle down or be given out to the learned men of medicine dotted around a country. Of course, it is worth noting that folk belief is likely going to be more useful than the scribblings of a tenured armchair expert, owing largely to the gulf of experience between one scholar and millennia of lived experience. But any researcher who starts from folk belief and extrapolates using dissection, anatomy, and magical investigation would indeed advance understanding significantly. These are some absolutely huge changes to be made to general university structures. No longer do we have priests in training studying for a single unified organised church, nor medical doctors in training leaving university to establish a practice solely to treat humans. We can go further, and we should, if the world justifies it. So, a D&D world. What will the most dedicated nerds do when given funding and time to figure things out? We can forget the 3 core subjects, or at least expand them significantly. In D&D, a complex planar cosmology is like a thing, and studying it tells us exactly where the gods live, what lines of power link our world closely to others, and where the worst threats are likely to come into our world. Systematized geometry is the truth of a planar situation, and that can only get more complex when we imagine that planar geometry is filled with impossibilities, infinite planes, and pinpricked sized enclaves of vast realities. Maths, at least on the cosmic scale, is going to get very important and very weird. Academics will not just be fighting over Copernicus or Brache's solar models, but infinitely more complex models of the universe and surrounding planes, including spatial geometrical impossibilities, and don't say they won't. We have been trying to map our own world since before we could sail the seas. Our own arrogance is a feature of many other fantasy species too. Wanting to map the cosmos will certainly be a massively important race and goal for any academic that wants to give it a go. Magic, at least in a wizardly sense, is a classic staple for a reason. In D&D worlds, magic can be taught, which means that universities are likely to become a hotbed of mages fast, mostly students from wealthy families paying inordinate amounts of money to be trained. The study of magic is like a whole thing and has been done, well, to death even, so many times in fantasy media. But what isn't covered nearly so often is using magic to study. Not necessarily in the sense of automatic annotating quills or magical memory techniques, but applying magical tools to discover results. Identify is the clearest and most dull example. What does this ancient mysterious item imbued with magic do? Oh, okay, that's the answer. Ancient texts in a dead language? Even warlocks can sometimes handle that. Translation, at least as an academic exercise, is likely to be nowhere near as critical when magic is involved, as we don't need breakthroughs like the Rosetta Stone when comprehend languages exists. Instead, like the early medieval scriptorums, books and scrolls would simply be copied magically into modern tongues. Although a skilled translator would still be massively useful to translate anything in a non-literal sense. So translation is certainly still a skill that's likely to be needed, just more interpreting literal meaning in an appropriate way. Magic gets most potent though when we think to experimentation. Divination spells, in short, solves the risks in experimenting and even the need to do proper experiments. Let's say a mage wants to discover what happens exactly when a bag of holding goes inside a portable hole. Augury. He now knows that his plan to put them together himself will lead to woe or bad things. So he sets up a contraption in a stone box miles from civilization. Clairvoyance. Now he can see the experiment with no risk to his own safety from start to finish. But we can go further. Suppose he has a theory as to where this combination's explosion or implosion spits out its debris. Then a reasonable next step is to commune with a deity, hopefully a deity of knowledge. The mage presents their theory. Such items are destroyed entirely, along with any sucked through the rift that is created. The answer? No. Curious. New theory. Everything sucked through the rift isn't destroyed. It still exists. Somewhere. Yes. Good. It must then go to another plane of existence then. The astral? Yes. Suddenly the mage would know the critical information without being put at any risk. But why stop there? By employing mathematical and statistical theory, commune takes on a whole new layer of potential. Binary search, for instance, allows the answer to any question with a defined set of options to be gathered in just a few yes or no answers. You want to know where in the cosmos a certain object is? List every plane, split that list in half, and ask if the object is anywhere in the first half of names. Repeat this for just a few questions and you will know exactly what plane this object is in. You could even theoretically use this to grid search a whole plane of existence with just a few spell slots. And this is also potentially doable with Contact Other Plane too, which gives you more questions but less specific expertise. The only way this fails is if it's in a place you missed on your list, or if nobody, not even the gods in the cosmos, knows the answer. At which point, you hand that question off to a doctoral student and set them on a case to figure it out. Be the first one in history to know that answer. This doesn't just work for finding things. Testing theories, diagnosing maladies, and even identifying monsters can all be done this way, assuming the list is complete. And if it isn't, again, that's just new research to be done. Through this and other more complex iterations of maths and a reliable font of knowledge, we can know everything we don't know much faster. This, I think, is why there's such an association between D&D styled wizards and mathematics. As much as Ed Greenwood and Elminster would deny it, with an understanding of things like this and of the potential of chained magic maths, wizardry becomes an immense force for quick answers to questions nobody has asked for millennia. It is for this reason that I believe mathematics, both theoretical/geometric and practical/statistical, would be university subjects in any D&D university. In addition, in terms of planar existence, there's also planar law to have a think about. It's very likely that Fae and Devil law will be studied clearly for contracts, immutable forces, and anything that is going to trip up a mortal in negotiations. There will be experts in planar law, absolutely studying in your best universities. But I feel I've rambled for a little too long. There is more to say, but I really shouldn't keep you. I hope this has been enough to stoke all those fires of imagination and get you thinking about what assumptions are left uninterrogated in your world building. Let me know if there's any other such topic I should be covering. But with that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.